The Dakota War is about to come to a close. All treaties made with Native Americans were nulled. Even the Ho-Chunk Native Americans who were not involved in the war were abolished from Minnesota. The convicted Dakota warriors were to be sentenced in Mankato. Some warriors, including Little Crow, had escaped into the Dakota territories to the west. The very people the warriors had fought for were held in a concentration camp under the cannons of Fort Snelling.
So I'm going to Pike Island. Many people don't know what happened at Pike Island in Minnesota. After the Dakota War had ended, some 1,600 Dakota were rounded up and put into a concentration camp on this island. Oh, jeez. Wow, okay. Yeah. After the war was over, all of the natives that were there, the U.S. government did not know exactly what to do with them. They had other reservations that they planned on bringing them to, so they shipped them down the Mississippi River and then up the Missouri so they can move farther west into the Dakota Territory. This particular island has a really big significance to the native people in this area. They visit it every year. To give you perspective, this is the Minnesota River and this is the Mississippi, and this is where like the confluence is, where it would be like the center of trade, anything west and anything north. This is Fort Snelling here, and Pike Island is this. All of the natives were held here. Dakota were kept there over the winter. They were blocked in, stockaded. Now, obviously it wasn't to the point of the kind of concentration camp you'd think it would be like in Nazi Germany. You know, they didn't line civilians up and shoot them. However, they were detained against their will in some of the most environmentally hazardous conditions possible. And this isn't the only time the United States has created concentration camps either. We did so to the Japanese during World War II. These things need to be taught.
President Abraham Lincoln had been personally reviewing the tribunal documents from camp release. Thanks to Lincoln and the efforts of Bishop Henry Whipple, 265 of the 303 Dakota that were to be executed had their sentences commuted to prison. 38 Dakota were still to be hanged. This wasn't popular in Minnesota, but Lincoln's decision still stood. The war ended as winter was just beginning on December 26, 1862. It was a cold and bitter morning in Mankato. The execution wasn't supposed to be the day after Christmas, but they didn't have enough rope for the gallows, and the execution was delayed 1 week. At 10 a.m., the 38 inmates were marched up the steps to the gallows while they sang a song of death. They wore their traditional buckskin clothes, and some chose to wear war paint. The executioner was Joseph Dooley, whose family had been killed during the war. He cut the rope that sprung the traps, and all 38 Dakota dropped. To this day, this is still the largest mass execution in United States history. The bodies hung for 20 minutes when they were all declared dead. Then they were taken down and to be transported to a mass grave on the edge of the Minnesota River. The bodies were dug up later that night by doctors willing to use them as cadavers for medical training. One of the 38 bodies, that of a chief known as Cut Nose, or Who Stands in the Clouds, wasn't buried until 138 years later in the year 2000. As it turns out, many of the bodies dug up after the mass execution were sent to William Worral Mayo. Mayo was the father of the brothers who started the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, which is now one of the top hospitals on the planet. The body of Cut Nose was used as a cadaver for medical training and other uses for 138 years. A hunt for the body had been undertaken after an inventory that was mandated by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, signed by George Bush Sr. in 1990. His skull was the first to be buried. It was on display in a doctor's office for a few years up to the burial. Some of his skin was found in a museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They were identified through historical records of his tattoos as well as records behind where the remains had come from.
300 Dakota died here in this concentration camp. That's almost 8 times as many that were executed at Mankato in the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Almost 8 times as many died here on this island.
In the spring and summer of 1863, the Dakota who were shipped out of the Pike Island concentration camp would arrive at their proposed reservations in the Nebraska and Dakota territories. Their futures looked bleak and uncertain. Unfortunately, they were sure to run into white settlement again. Governor Ramsey had adopted a policy of scalping ransoms in Minnesota. He declared that the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. Without proper documentation or credentials, many Dakota who had even assisted whites in the war, such as translators or guides, were at risk of being shot and scalped for money. General Pope, Sibley's commanding officer, ordered by Lincoln to fight the Dakota and native tribes in the region of the U.S., said, "The horrible massacres of women and children and the outrageous abuse of female prisoners still alive call for a punishment beyond human power to inflict. There will be no peace in this region by virtue of treaties and Indian faith. It is my purpose utterly to exterminate the Sioux if I have the power to do so, and even if it requires a campaign lasting the whole of next year. Destroy everything belonging to them and force them out of the plains, unless, as I suggest, you can capture them. They are to be treated as maniacs or wild beasts, and by no means as people with whom treaties or compromises can be made." The Sioux reservation had been closed, the tribes had been removed, the warriors had been executed and jailed. The public still wondered, where was Little Crow?
As a little kid, all of us are taught that the monsters and bad guys of the world are evil demons or monsters. The worst things in the world aren't us. Humans are. And whenever I hear people say that, like, ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other like terrorist organizations or whoever we deem to be our enemy as less than human, they're dogs, they're animals. You should not do that. They're human, just like us. We're capable of doing these terrible things, and we need to recognize that, otherwise we may repeat it